sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you'll become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
How laws are made sounds simple when you look at the 1980s Schoolhouse Rock cartoon. In fact, that cartoon does, in fact, accurately explain the process, but within those steps, there's a lot of nitty-gritty horse trading and compromise that certainly cannot be captured in the 2 minutes of that video. The fact is that laws come about as a result of citizens and corporations and political leaders and advocacy groups all coming together around an issue and expressing their concerns. And sometimes laws are compromised, and sometimes laws reflect one victory over another side or the results of the election. But laws do constitute national policy or jurisdictional policy. When a law sets out that we have to not pollute, then the national policy is against pollution. And so what we want to discuss during this e-lecture is the legislative branch, how it functions and how it establishes national policy. The Constitution, in Article 1 of the Constitution, the United States Congress is established. The Congress is an outgrowth of the Continental Congress that convened to write the Declaration of Independence and to write the Constitution. Our Congress sets up a bicameral legislature or a bicameral legislative branch. Meaning there's two bodies. There's an upper house and a lower house. They don't refer to themselves as that, but that's what they are. The upper house is the Senate, much like the House of Lords in England. It is made up. It was created to be the aristocracy, the landed gentry. Basically, in this grand experiment that we called America, what the Senate was designed to do was to protect the interests of the wealthy against the rabble that could sometimes amass in the House of Representatives, those that weren't as wealthy, that may be more represented in the House of Representatives. The Senate, to go further on that aristocracy theory, the Senate at one time during the beginning of the democracy was not elected by the people, but was appointed by the legislature. So in essence, the General Assembly of North Carolina would elect 2 senators, meaning those that were elected and in the know, more likely the aristocracy, would elect from amongst themselves another member of the aristocracy to represent the state, 2 members of the aristocracy. And that was a way of assuring that those who indeed were well-heeled, moneyed, landed, had because wealth was land at that point, those people would have representatives that would protect their interests in this new national legislature. The Senate hasn't lost, even though it is elected now, it hasn't lost that aristocracy. It is commonly referred to as the Club of Millionaires because virtually everyone in the Senate is a millionaire there. The House of Representatives is the lower house. It is closer to the people, whereas Senate, there's 2 representatives for every state, meaning 2 people represent the big state of North Carolina, the big state of California, the big state of New York, versus now 13 people represent the state of North Carolina from the United States House, because they're made up of smaller districts, they are closer to the people, and are more likely to feel the pulse of the people. They're more likely also to be very close to the feelings and wants, desires, fears, hopes of the people, whereas the Senate tends to end up being more moderate because they have to reflect the entire state and the views of people from the entire state. They have to galvanize a consensus in order to be elected from the whole state. There are no term limits in either the House or the Senate. And that's an interesting thing. You hear a lot of talk about term limits, but there are none in either one of those houses. There are no term limits, and that's an interesting thing, as I said. Robert Byrd, born in 1917, is a senior senator from West Virginia. Actually started serving in the Senate has been in the Senate since 1959. Is currently the president pro tem of the Senate, and is known for being the only current senator, the only senator to have also been a member of the KKK. He now has sort of changed his formal evil ways and has voted for a few civil rights bills, but his ugly past doesn't fall too far from where he is. It isn't forgotten, at least. I heard a BBC commentator one day speaking of the Democratic takeover of the House, saying that it makes no difference whether the Democrats take over the House or the Senate. The power is roughly equal. That's not true. Revenue bills are initiated in the House. That doesn't make a difference because they still have to be passed by the Senate. But articles of impeachment originate in the House. So if someone's going to be impeached, it has to start in the House of Representatives. When Bill Clinton was impeached, it started in the House of Representatives. You would have never had an impeachment trial of Bill Clinton if the Democrats had held the House. It would have never happened there. And so there was weeks of political theater that would not have occurred had the Democrats had the House. So they aren't equal in that respect. On the other hand, the Senate has the power to approve Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, and cabinet members. Supreme Court justices in particular, since they served for life, that extends a president's term. Well, I mean, we still have Supreme Court justices from Gerald Ford, or justices, I'm sorry, on the bench from Gerald Ford, not Supreme Court justices, but justices on the bench from Gerald Ford. And you still have justices from Ronald Reagan serving on the Supreme Court. Therefore, the president's term is extended significantly based upon the appointment powers, particularly to the judiciary. As a result, the Senate's ability to approve or not approve a member of the Supreme Court is very important. You will learn later on about the fact that the Senate didn't confirm Robert Bork, a fellow who indeed probably joined other people with a white robe rather than a black robe. I shouldn't say that, but he was extremely conservative. The Senate disapproved him, and it was only because of the Democratic control of the Senate that occurred. So there is this power is not exactly equal. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives, 100 members of the Senate. Obviously, 2 from every state in the Senate. In the House, those are based upon proportionate representation. The House run every election. Every 2 years, the whole entire House of Representatives is up for re-election, and they have to run for their seats. The Senate every 6 years. So only a third of the Senate seats are up for re-election in any given year. The House is organized in such a way that it has a strong leadership, and therefore that leadership tends to try to whip House members into shape. If you do not vote in the way that the leadership wants and don't get excused to do so, there's a good likelihood that you will not be assigned to the kinds of committees that you want to be assigned to that help you get reelected. Basically, the party in power is going to do the assigning, and if you're in that party in power, they expect you to toe the line. If you're not in that party in power, then it doesn't make any difference. So you're probably not going to be treated well anyway. In the Senate, they're much more a club of gentlemen. Yeah, they have ladies now, but that's what they call themselves. And that more cordial, courtly Senate approach has leadership isn't quite as strong. Senators represent broad states, and therefore they have to look at what these votes will do to their political life, and therefore they're given a lot more flexibility. The Senate is much more prestigious than the House of Representatives, and you see people leaving the House to run for the Senate. You hardly ever see anyone voluntarily leaving the Senate to run for the House. The Senate requires that you be 30 years of age, that you have been a citizen for 9 years. You do not have to be a natural-born citizen. You can be a naturalized citizen. So Arnold Schwarzenegger could be a senator. The House requires you to be age 25, have been a citizen for 7 years, and a resident of the state. Both require you to be a resident of the state that you're running from. However, I might add, a House member has to be a resident of the state, but they do not have to be a resident of the district that they are running from. Walter Jones, for example, represented his congressional district while living in another congressional district for a short while. So you do not have to live in the district that you represent. In the House of Representatives, there is less diversity of political thought, less flexibility. The political parties are important in the House of Representatives. They expect you to toe the line. And House districts tend to be small. We will talk about it. They tend to be constructed in such a way that there is political, philosophical cohesion in districts. So they tend to come from districts that are either liberal or conservative, and they don't have to cobble together a consensus in the middle, because House districts tend to be extreme one way or another. The congressional district that Durham is in is a Democratic district. It's a safe Democratic district. It's going to be an unusual election. It's happened, but it's going to be an unusual election that the Durham district swings Republican. On the other hand, there are districts out in the mountain that just aren't going to vote Democratic. I don't care who's running on the Democratic Party. Again, there's some odd elections with some unique personalities that may indeed swing the election one way or the other. But generally speaking, those elections are not going to be are going to be pretty well defined because the political philosophies are cohesive in those districts, and you're not going to get much difference. And so they expect you now to toe the line and do what the party says. In the Senate, there's a lot more diversity of thought. They're much more moderate because they have to run from an entire state. They have to cobble together a consensus amongst them. Probably one of the important checks and balances that the legislative unit has is not only the ability to approve appointments of the president, but to impeach the president or impeach other people. The other real issue is that they get in session and debate while in session, and so you get a chance to enter into debate, which helps define the national policy and the national agenda. What I'm going to do now is show you an example of a member of the House during the Nixon impeachment trial getting a chance to express her opinion in ways that, one, launched her to national prominence, but also crystallized for everyone the issue of the Nixon impeachment. Now, I would say that you probably do need to pay a little attention to the standard that she articulates for impeachment, because that's an important standard, and this standard applies to whether we're trying to impeach a president or trying to impeach a member of the judiciary. And really, it's in all likelihood a standard that applies in many of the states, and when they're trying to impeach an elected officer.
I recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jordan, for the purpose of general debate, not to exceed a period of 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, I join my colleague, Mr. Rangel, in thanking you for giving the junior members of this committee the glorious opportunity of sharing the pain of this inquiry. Mr. Chairman, you are a strong man, and it has not been easy, but we have tried as best we can to give you as much assistance as possible. Earlier today, we heard the beginning of the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. We the people. It's a very eloquent beginning. But when that document was completed on the 17th of September in 1787, I was not included in that we the people. I felt somehow for many years that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton just left me out by mistake. But through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, I have finally been included in we the people. Today I am an inquisitor, and hyperbole would not be fictional and would not overstate the solemnness that I feel right now. My faith in the Constitution is whole, it is complete, it is total. And I am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution. Who can so properly be the inquisitors for the nation as the representatives of the nation themselves? The subjects of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men. And that's what we're talking about. In other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. It is wrong, I suggest, it is a misreading of the Constitution for any member here to assert that for a member to vote for an article of impeachment means that that member must be convinced that the president should be removed from office. The Constitution doesn't say that. The powers relating to impeachment are an essential check in the hands of the body, the legislature, against and upon the encroachments of the executive. The division between the two branches of the legislature, the House and the Senate, assigning to the one the right to accuse and to the other the right to judge. The framers of this Constitution were very astute. They did not make the accusers and the judges the same person. We know the nature of impeachment. We've been talking about it a while now. It is chiefly designed for the president and his high ministers to somehow be called into account. It is designed to bridle the executive if he engages in excesses. It is designed as a method of national inquest into the conduct of public men. The framers confided in the Congress the power, if need be, to remove the president in order to strike a delicate balance between a president swollen with power and grown tyrannical and preservation of the independence of the executive. The nature of impeachment, a narrowly channeled exception to the separation of powers maxim. The Federal Convention of 1787 said that. It limited impeachment to high crimes and misdemeanors and discounted and opposed the term maladministration. It is to be used only for great misdemeanors, so it was said in the North Carolina Ratification Convention. And in the Virginia Ratification Convention, we do not trust our liberty to a particular branch. We need one branch to check the other. No one need be afraid. The North Carolina Ratification Convention, no one need be afraid that officers who commit oppression will pass with immunity. Prosecutions of impeachments will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community, said Hamilton in the Federalist Papers number 65. We divide into parties, more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. I do not mean political parties in that sense. The drawing of political lines goes to the motivation behind impeachment. But impeachment must proceed within the confines of the constitutional term, high crime and misdemeanors. Of the impeachment process, It was Woodrow Wilson who said that nothing short of the grossest offenses against the plain law of the land will suffice to give them speed and effectiveness. Indignation so great as to overgrow party interest may secure a conviction, but nothing else can. Common sense would be revolted if we engaged upon this process for petty reasons. Congress has a lot to do. Appropriations, tax reform, health insurance, campaign finance reform, housing, environmental protection, energy sufficiency, mass transportation. Pettiness cannot be allowed to stand in the face of such overwhelming problems. So today we're not being petty. We're trying to be big because the task we have before us is a big one. This morning, in a discussion of the evidence, we are told that the evidence which purports to support the allegations of misuse of the CIA by the president is thin. We're told that that evidence is insufficient. What that recital of the evidence this morning did not include is what the president did know on June the 23rd, 1972. The president did know that it was Republican money, that it was money from the Committee for the Re-election of the President, which was found in the possession of one of the burglars arrested on June the 17th. What the president did know on the 23rd of June was the prior activities of E. Howard Hunt, which included his participation in the break-in of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, which included Howard Hunt's participation in the Dita Beard ITT affair, which included Howard Hunt's fabrication of cables designed to discredit the Kennedy administration. We were further cautioned today that perhaps these proceedings ought to be delayed because certainly there would be new evidence forthcoming from the President of the United States. There has not even been an obfuscated indication that this committee would receive any additional materials from the president. The committee subpoena is outstanding, and if the president wants to supply that material, the committee sits here. The fact is that on yesterday, the American people waited with great anxiety for 8 hours, not knowing whether their president would obey an order of the Supreme Court of the United States. At this point, I would like to juxtapose a few of the impeachment criteria with some of the actions the president has engaged in. Impeachment criteria. James Madison, from the Virginia Ratification Convention. If the president be connected in any suspicious manner with any person and there be grounds to believe that he will shelter him, he may be impeached. We have heard time and time again that the evidence reflects the payment to defendants, money. The president had knowledge that these funds were being paid, and these were funds collected for the 1972 presidential campaign. We know that the president met with Mr. Henry Peterson 27 times to discuss matters related to Watergate, and immediately thereafter met with the very persons who were implicated in the information Mr. Peterson was receiving. The words are, if the president is connected in any suspicious manner with any person, and there be grounds to believe that he will shelter that person, he may be impeached. Just a story. Impeachment is intended for occasional and extraordinary cases where a superior power acting for the whole people is put into operation to protect their rights and rescue their liberties from violations. We know about the Houston plan. We know about the break-in of the psychiatrist's office. We know that there was absolute, complete direction on September 3rd when the president indicated that a surreptitious entry had been made in Dr. Fielding's office after having met with Mr. Ehrlichman and Mr. Young. Protect their rights, rescue their liberties from violation. The Carolina Ratification Convention impeachment criteria: those are impeachable who behave amiss or betray their public trust. Beginning shortly after the Watergate break-in and continuing to the present time, the President has engaged in a series of public statements and actions designed to thwart the lawful investigation by government prosecutors. Moreover, the President has made public announcements and assertions bearing on the Watergate case, which the evidence will show he knew to be false. These assertions, false assertions, impeachable, those who misbehave, those who behave amiss or betray the public trust. James Madison again at the Constitutional Convention: a president is impeachable if he attempts to subvert the Constitution. The Constitution charges the president with the task of taking care that the laws be faithfully executed. And yet, the president has counseled his aides to commit perjury, willfully disregard the secrecy of grand jury proceedings, conceal surreptitious entry, attempt to compromise a federal judge, while publicly displaying his cooperation with the processes of criminal justice. A president is impeachable if he attempts to subvert the Constitution. If the impeachment provision in the Constitution of the United States will not reach the offenses charged here, then perhaps that 18th century Constitution should be abandoned to a 20th century paper shredder. Has the president committed offenses and planned and directed and acquiesced in a course of conduct which the Constitution will not tolerate? That's the question. We know that. We know the question. We should now forthwith proceed to answer the question. It is reason and not passion which must guide our deliberations, guide our debate, and guide our decision. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution sets forth the powers of Congress, and certainly it has a general welfare clause that the Congress is able to enumerate or pass laws to promote the general welfare. But then there's a list of powers that is specifically enumerated in that for Congress to have. And then there's the necessary and proper clause, which is sort of a catch-all clause, which says I can do anything that's necessary and proper to do any of the powers that this Constitution gives the Congress to do. And it certainly gives them the power to regulate commerce, to promote science, to coin money, to organize and supply an army, and to protect us against invasions. Certainly those things that any legislative body needs to do in order to maintain a nation. Implied in all of this is Congress also has the power to oversee the agencies of the federal government to the extent that those agencies are carrying out laws enacted by Congress or carrying out the budget mandates that Congress has set forth. And that oversight duty is an important duty, and it is an important part of the checks and balances. Congress has the ability to look over the executive branch. That that actually makes divided government more important in the U.S. because what it does, it means that Congress has a chance to look over what the president does. You will find that when the president and Congress are in the same party, oftentimes there is overreaching because Congress is not going to scrutinize the executive branch as much. And I think you saw that when the Bush administration, which took a very, very expansive view of the role of the president, and when they, in fact, engaged in some of the firings of members of the U.S. attorney or U.S. attorneys because these U.S. attorneys did not pass a conservative litmus test. Not that they weren't doing a good job, but they weren't conservative enough for them, and which meant that you had the Bush administration basically trying to politicize the Justice Department. And while, yes, the Attorney General is an appointee of the President, the Justice Department is called the Justice Department because their job is to promote justice through the judicial system for all Americans without regards to partisan politics. And so that was a major concern. And so what you will now see is a clip from the House of Representatives doing some of its oversight responsibility. And that oversight responsibility, again, is a major part of the Congress's duty in a democracy to oversee the workings of the executive branch to the extent allowed.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. Let me begin the questions. I want to ask how the U.S. Attorney termination list came to be. Who suggested putting most of these U.S. attorneys on the list and why? Now that's the question that overhangs everything we're doing here. If we can answer that, I think outside of the reticence of the White House to cooperate, we would make incredible gains in trying to put this matter to rest, as the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, has suggested we do as soon as possible. Tell me about it.
Mr. Chairman, I accept full responsibility for the notion of doing an evaluation of the performance of United States attorneys. I think as a matter of good government, we have an obligation as heads of the department to ensure that public servants are in fact doing their job. And therefore, I directed Mr. Sampson, then the Deputy Chief of Staff, and most recently my former Chief of Staff, to coordinate and organize a review of the performance of United States attorneys around the country. I expected that Mr. Sampson would consult with the senior leadership of the department, that he would consult with individuals who would know about the performance of United States attorneys much more than I.
But, Mr. Attorney General, you're the one that is here at the hearing.
Yes.
You're the one that we talk to as the Judiciary Committee regularly communicates with the head of the Department of Justice. I approve and congratulate you on all those hearings and investigation. But tell me, just tell me, how the U.S. Attorney termination list.
What you see is Congressman Conyers questioning the Attorney General in this clip. And the only reason you would have this kind of questioning is because the House has now turned to a majority Democratic, and you have a Republican President, George Bush. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had that kind of questioning. George Bush would have been allowed to, just as other presidents with majority in both houses are allowed to go on and be unquestioned, because the party in power controls the proceedings of Congress. And if the president's party is in power, they certainly are not going to allow these kinds of questions that potentially embarrass the president, show a politicization of the Justice Department, corruption of it. They're not going to show that. Leadership in Congress, in particular leadership in the House, is based upon the majority party. If you're part of the majority party, then you may be able to get a leading role in controlling the agenda setting process in the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House, the majority leader of the House, the majority whip of the House are elected by the caucus of the majority party. The majority party is those people who have the most, that party that has the most members of the 435, those who have more than 50% of the 435, that's the majority party, and they will elect the Speaker of the House and the majority leader and the majority whip. And those are offices within that caucus, but they're elected by the entire Congress. The Speaker of the House is elected by the entire Congress. Majority Leader and Majority Whip are then pretty much come at the direction of the Speaker, and the caucus tends to go along with them. In terms of the Minority Leader and Minority Whip, those are selected by the minority party in the Congress, and in this case the House, and the Minority Leader and the Minority Whip are again selected in that caucus. Those are not congressional officers, so they're just elected in that caucus. The president of the Senate is always the vice president. Doesn't make any difference who has the majority of the majority in the Senate. The president of the Senate is always the vice president. That's the reason why Vice President Cheney said he was not a part of the executive branch. He was a part of the legislative branch. He only thought that when he was trying to avoid doing something that the executive branch had to do, however. And no legal scholars thought that he had any legitimate grounds to make that assertion. But the president of the Senate is always the vice president. The president pro temporary of the Senate is a member of the Senate, a member of the majority party in the Senate. That is a Senate office, but it basically is selected in the caucus of the majority party. That party determines who they will vote for, and then they go out and there's a vote, and the minority party will vote for its candidate, and the majority party will vote for its candidate, and the majority party will carry it, since the majority party has more than 51 votes. But it is basically elected in the caucus, and then the whole Senate has the vote, and the majority caucus will win. Now, we'll tell you that in certain state legislators, they sometimes do some deals which may cause someone who does not come out of the caucus to actually end up being President pro tem or Speaker of the House, but that's an issue for another day. All the other positions, the assistant leader and majority whip, those are pretty much positions that are out of the caucus. The minority leaders, minority whips are positions coming out of the minority caucus. They're not Senate positions. They're selected by that caucus, and they lead that caucus. It does need to be noted at this point that presidential succession includes some of these legislative leaders. Obviously, if the president can no longer serve or dies, the vice president takes over as the president. But if for some reason a vice president cannot serve or dies quickly, then the presidential line of succession then goes to the Speaker of the House, then the President pro temporary of the Senate, and then the Secretary of State, and will then follow down a list of cabinet leaders. House districts are supposed to be proportionate, meaning each House member is supposed to represent the same number of people, and roughly the same number of people. They aren't going to be exactly the same. The Senate, on the other hand, represents states, and therefore they're not going to be equal. But House are to represent districts, and they're supposed to be the one-man, one-vote requirement requires that they be roughly equivalent. That is done through the census. Every 10 years, the United States does a census, and then the legislatures of the various states will reapportion. That means they will redraw the lines, and when they redraw those lines, they will create new House districts. Sometimes they'll get more House districts. Sometimes they'll get fewer. Many times, most of the time, they'll have the same. And they redraw those lines. Now, in redrawing those lines, many legislators draw districts that favor one party or the other. And that's the reason why you see people fighting so hard to hold on to legislatures right at the turn of the decade, because you want to have you want to be in control of the legislature at the turn of the decade so that you control the drawing of the congressional districts. One of the major things in Texas was the Texas legislature helped turn the House Republican, because the Texas legislature redrew lines in such a way that Texas would elect substantially more Republican to the U.S. House, and therefore would result in changing the composition of the House, so the majority of the House members would be Republican. So the redistricting process reflects the change in population, but it can also have, and does have, significant political overtones, that because House districts are drawn in such a way in many instances that it makes them safe for members of one party or the other. Political watchers can tell how a district will vote. They can look at the population trends, the income, the education, the way they've historically voted, and make a very accurate prediction as to how certain areas will vote. In fact, you can go down and tell basically how a block will vote with regards to looking at the political history of a block. So with that in mind, when legislatures begin to draw districts for both their state legislature and for their Congress, many of them draw lines which will favor one party or the other. Now, they draw lines to make the district safe for their party. Take, for example, in the South, if you have a district that is largely white, high income, educated, you're going to have a good shot that district is going to lean Republican. If that district has, however, substantial numbers of minorities in it, with some mixed population in terms of middle class voters, then you may be it'll trend either way. It's going to swing, and you won't know exactly. If that district is a substantial minority population, majority minority population, that district's going to be predominantly black. There's going to be a predominantly black district, a predominantly minority district. That district's probably going to be a Democratic district. Gerrymandering is illegal to the extent that gerrymandering is done in such a way as to dilute minority voting strength. However, gerrymandering is not illegal if it is just done in such a way that it doesn't dilute minority voting strength, but tends to enhance one political party's political ambitions. That doesn't make it that is perfectly legal. In fact, there have been a number of cases in which state legislators have disproportionately done it, drawn districts that just were looking like snakes and salamanders and odd shapes, and the courts have said that's fine. They didn't discriminate against minorities, and therefore it was they drew them for political reasons, and that is perfectly legal. What will happen, however, what happens is when the districts are drafted in such a way as to not accord a person one man, one vote, and in such a way that it violates the Constitution, then in those instances the Supreme Court has said that it is unconstitutional. However, let me say the Supreme Court is very reluctant to upset the districts drawn by a duly elected General Assembly unless those districts in some way discriminate based on race. If they discriminate on other reasons, it is much harder to upset the districts and get a court to superimpose its judgment over that of the General Assembly, because that's not the court's job, that's the General Assembly's job. Let's, at this point, look at Newt Gingrich, who is the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, a Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, talk about gerrymandering. Now, let me also say the irony is he became Speaker because the Texas General Assembly redrew the lines for Congress in Texas, and redrew those lines so that a number of Republican congressmen would be added to the Texas delegation, and therefore his contract on America was able to be, or with America, was able to be executed because he had gerrymandering on his side.
And that was, if people want to change things, they should run. As you know, and as most people know, many of the states have gerrymandered their districts such that it becomes it's not very competitive in many districts. Just as an example, Maryland and Virginia. If you look at Maryland, you have, I guess you could say it's a baby blue state in the red state model, and then you have Virginia, which is a light pink on the red blue state model. And yet, if you look at the congressmen in Virginia, it's very heavily weighted in the Republican direction, whereas in Maryland it's very heavily weighted in the Democratic direction. And so with districts that are not competitive, I'm just curious about what your take is on how to make these districts more representative of the populations of the states where they come from. Thank you.
That's a very good question. I want to divide it into two parts, though. On redistricting, I favor the Iowa model. In Iowa, they today have a very open system where a nonpartisan board draws the lines. Nobody thinks the Iowa system has been gerrymandered, and it's really designed to have districts that are geographically coherent that make sense, whereas in gerrymandering, we sometimes have districts that look totally weird. The original term, Eldridge Gerry, was a Federalist in Massachusetts, and in 1812, they wrote the lines, and somebody said, oh, that one district looks like a salamander. And the other person said, oh, no, that's a gerrymander. And that's where the word comes from Eldridge Gerry. So we've been drawing lines for political reasons all the way back to 1812. It's a long American tradition. But I think it's wrong. I think it leads to bad government. However, even in the short run, right this minute, this may surprise you, there are no safe seats in a primary. That is, even when you have gerrymandered and say this is a safe Republican seat and this is a safe Democrat seat, my answer is fine. Run against the Democrat in the Democratic primary and run against the Republican in the Republican primary, and the forces of change can still win because you can beat them in the primaries. And I do not believe, when I tried to build a Republican majority, all sorts of people said to me, oh, you'll never win a big election. Incumbents are so strong. The districts are so rigged. We picked up 53 seats in one election. And all of a sudden people said, well, you weren't allowed to do that. Well, how do we do it? We went out and we had ideas. We had a contract with America. We talked about welfare reform, balancing the budget, cutting taxes, strengthening defense. And the result was people all around the country said, gee, I'd like that. Now, we understand that with new products. We understand the idea you go out and you advertise a new product and people say, gee, I think I'll go to the store and maybe try that. And so I would argue that even in a rigged district, you can beat an incumbent. I ran twice against a very senior incumbent. I almost beat him twice. I announced the third time, he retired, and I won the seat on the third race. I mean, nobody said that the pursuit of happiness is easy. And so you may have to work for a while, but there is no safe seat in America if the incumbent is bad enough. Like my competitor was a Democrat, but I was in a he was actually the dean of the delegation and on the appropriations committee. I mean, I was probably nuts, but you know, I mean, people said I couldn't beat him, and they were right, but I could wear him out. Well, I mean, but Frank Wolf from Northern Virginia is a good example. He had to run 3 times. You know, I'm just saying that if you're prepared to go out and do it, you can have a remarkable impact in public life.
The most important power of Congress is to make laws. Now, that power is certainly limited by the Constitution. The Congress can only make laws that are consistent with the Constitution and that are in accordance with the powers granted to the Congress by the Constitution. The legislative power is shared between the House and the Senate. Nothing can get passed without both House and Senate approving it. What generally happens is the bill is going to originate in either the House or the Senate. It will then go from, once passed in one House, it will go to the other House. Now, there are many instances in which a bill is actually being pushed through the House and the Senate simultaneously, but because of the different personalities, the different political pressures, the bills take different forms, different shapes. And so what'll happen is a bill will get passed by the House or the bill will get passed by the Senate and go over to the other House, and then what the other House does is reform that bill consistent with their thoughts and pass a bill that is similar but not exactly alike. When they do that, then you basically have one bill that's passed in the Senate that does what they want it to do, another bill passed in the House that does a similar thing but not exactly, and what happens is the bill goes to conference. And when the bill goes to conference, the conference is made up of both of delegates from the House and the Senate. They then will get together, work out the differences, and one bill will then get passed. The compromised bill will then get passed by the House and the Senate. But both the House and the Senate tend to work by committee, and which means that when a bill is first introduced, it's going to go into a committee that is going to make a determination about whether that bill goes forward or not. And that's the reason why members of the minority party generally don't have things to go through, because it gets sent to a committee. That committee chair is always a committee chair appointed by the Speaker of the House or the President, Majority Leader of the Senate. And in those instances, those committee chairs are always going to only let bills through that are consistent with the wishes of their party's caucus. So if you're in the minority party, you have to be friends with and find someone in the majority party to coalesce with. And if you're in the Senate, because they have a 60 vote filibuster rule, meaning you can prevent any bill from getting to the Senate floor unless you have 60 votes to stop debate. Then in that case, you generally have to also have friends in the other party, and even in the minority party, because you can't get something through the Senate and onto the out of committee and out of debating stage, at least, unless you have members of the other party, because it's very unusual that the Senate has 60 members from one party or the other. Making laws is important because making laws that are necessary and proper give Congress a significant amount of power. They can regulate commerce, they control spending, they can determine taxation, they create courts. And another power that is often overlooked, only Congress can declare wars. The president is the commander-in-chief. The president can commit our soldiers for short stints of time onto foreign battlefields onto battlefields, but only Congress can declare war. And that happens, and all of these powers happen as a result of the national political climate, the national hopes and fears that are in existence. And what you'll have is citizens with exerting pressure, commercial business interests exerting pressure, and senators and congressmen thinking about their political livelihood, putting pressure on them. And so all of those things result in the environment, create the policy-making environment in which laws are going to be developed and policy is going to be developed. A member of the House or Senate may act in different roles at different times in their career. John Kennedy wrote a book about profiles in courage. That book is about people, political leaders, many of them in Congress, who used their best judgment, but they acted against their best political judgment, but acted in the best judgment for the country. But in almost all the instances in that book, those people who acted and used their best judgment and who history proved them to be correct, but were acting against the sentiments of their people, in all instances, or in virtually every instance, those people lost or ended their political life. That's sort of the trustee role, using your best judgment, even though it may be different from that of the voters. That can cost a congressperson, any political leader, their political life. And the delegate role, you're there just to reflect the voters. And as a result of their reflecting the voters, you sort of put your finger up in the air, see which way the wind is blowing, see which way popularity is going, and you vote reflecting that. In the political phase, you're basically there trying to act in such a way as to enhance your own political career. And those people are generally not well respected, but let's face the facts. Many people rise to prominence and power because they've acted in the political role. They've acted as trustees and as delegates, and they switch depending upon what is best. If the heat is too hot, then they're going to go in the delegate role. If the heat is not all that hot, they will do what is best, and that gives them the ability to save their political life. Then there's the partisan role, and that is you're just going to be a puppet of your party. That'll let you rise through the political ranks within Congress, but it could during elections in which your party is not in favor, then it could result in you being seen as a puppet of your party, and result in you being swept out with other members of your party. So that role is not necessarily a safe role. There's always been debates as to what a representative should do. Should the representative use their best judgment, or should they in fact represent the people? In many instances, representatives try to convince the people, campaign with the people as to what is best for them. But in a lot of those instances, they're not successful, and that puts them in the difficult position of having to figure out: do I act as a delegate and reflect the attitude of my voters, or do I act as a trustee and vote in the best interest of my people? Many people about some of the trade, NAFTA, would say, well, trade is good for our economy in a whole, but if I vote this way, I am going to put many of the people in my district out of work. And in those instances, you're in a really tight situation, because you know if you put them out of work, they're putting you out of work. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about how a bill becomes law. Your little cartoon was pretty accurate. Bills are introduced, and now in order for something to get on the public agenda, there has to be some entity, there has to be some problem, and some constituency trying to get that problem solved. Merely because there's a problem, if there's no one complaining about the problem, it's not going to create a problem. Or if there's no one powerful complaining about a problem, if problems that tend to bother non-resident aliens who can't vote, those problems aren't going to get solved, because those problems are not problems of voters. Solving those problems won't help the congressperson or the senator one bit. What the senator is trying to do is solve problems of constituents, voters, or people who have money or can link them to money. So you have to have some linking mechanism, some mechanism that causes the problem to come to the attention of those decision makers, those policy makers. And that means there has to be enough public publicity, or enough people galvanized around it, or enough money galvanized around it, that it comes to the attention, and therefore decision makers, lawmakers, policymakers think that it's worth someone trying to resolve the problem. Now, what happens is when a bill is introduced, it goes to a committee. That committee looks at the bill, marks it up, revamps it, changes it, and then reports it out. Or it may not report it out. If it does not like the bill, then it may not report it out, or may report it out unfavorably. A chair will, but chairs are very powerful entities, and sometimes may not report it out. It'll report out to the floor, and on the floor, the bill is going to may get sent to another committee if it has some other aspect. And those are bills that they really don't like, that may get sent to another committee. It got out of one, but the leadership doesn't like it, so it'll get sent to another. Or if it doesn't get sent to another committee, then it could be amended on the floor. There'll be people introducing bills that are amendments to it. And then finally, you may get an up or down vote on it. Once you get that up or down vote, it will go to the other chamber. Assuming it passes, it goes to the other chamber. And the other chamber goes through the exact same process, committee and revamping, amendments on the floor, up or down vote, or come sent back to other committees. If it is favorable and it gets another up vote, but it's likely changed, it then goes to a conference, and that conference committee then will make the compromise. It takes a lot of bills go through a lot of changes. I mean, you start out with one thing, but because there are various entities interested in probably every line in that bill, those entities will force changes out there, and as I said, all of those entities come to bear. Those constituents in the district, those lobbyists out there, the business interests, all of those come to bear to try to shape any bill that has the possibility of being passed. Issues come to the floor and members' attention because of a number of factors. Members have interest groups that are very interested in moving a bill along, or a cause along, or a policy along. The Environmental Protection Club, the Environmental Protection Associations, Greenpeace, all have the National Rifle Association. All of these interest groups have lobbyists. These lobbyists are providing campaign contributions. These lobbyists are sending out flyers to a massive group of members that are enthusiastic about this particular cause, and they're reveling them up, and they can rev them up either for a congressman or against a congressman, and that always gets to a congressman's attention. You've got the political caucus that the congressman is in. The congressman or senator is in a political caucus. They have to pay attention to that caucus because they can be ostracized in that caucus and never move up in the leadership, never get the good committees, and those good committees are important. If you are in New York City and you get put on the agriculture committee, that may not be a good committee for you. When your constituents are more interested in urban policy. Congressmen have to listen to their constituents. Very seldom do congressmen vote against the well-organized, well-funded, vocal constituency that is against something. There are political action committees. Political action committees, unions have political action committees. Even associations of corporations have political action committees. Even corporations now have political action committees, and they have a number of just unaffiliated political action committees around a cause. And they influence the congressperson's or the senator's thoughts on things. Congress has, and many of these are MPAs, has a staff, and this staff's job is to research issues, to put their fingers up in the air and figure out which way the political wind is blowing, and that staff is going to provide a significant amount of advice. In fact, in many instances, if you're trying to lobby, you want to lobby the staff first, because that staff has a significant amount of influence. The party that the person is in has influence over the Congress or the senator. Again, they are going to help fund the campaign. They may run somebody against a rogue senator or rogue congressman, and so in those instances, you can use their party to influence them. And obviously colleagues influence them. But to a large extent, Congress is influenced by the commercial lobbyists, the business lobby. The business lobby is very important because they have significant amounts of money, and they have a significant amount of people who research, who do nothing but lobby in this particular area. When I worked for DuPont, the only thing I lobbied in was solid and hazardous waste. I knew more about it than anyone around. That's the only thing I had to do, and I lobbied in it each and every day, Congress and members in the executive branch. Now, what we're going to do is look at an exemplar about Congress and the impact of lobby on various issues.
If you've ever wondered why the cost of prescription drugs in the United States are the highest in the world, or why it's illegal to import cheaper drugs from Canada or Mexico, you need look no further than the pharmaceutical lobby and its influence in Washington, D.C. According to a new study by the Center for Public Integrity, congressmen are outnumbered 2-to-1 by lobbyists for an industry that spends roughly $100 million a year in campaign contributions and lobbying expenses to protect its profits. And one reason those profits have exceeded Wall Street's expectations is the Medicare prescription drug bill. It was passed 3.5 years ago, but its effects are still reverberating through the halls of Congress, providing a window into how the lobby works.
Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
The unorthodox roll call on one of the most expensive bills ever placed before the House of Representatives began in the middle of the night, long after most people in Washington had switched off C-SPAN and gone to sleep. The only witnesses were congressional staffers, hundreds of lobbyists, and U.S. representatives like Dan Burton of Illinois and Walter Jones of North Carolina.
The pharmaceutical lobbyists wrote the bill. The bill was over 1,000 pages, and it got to the members of the House that morning, and we voted for it at about 3 a.m. in the morning.
Why did the vote finally take place at 3 o'clock in the morning?
Well, I think a lot of the shenanigans that were going on that night, they didn't want on national television in prime time.
The House will be in order. The House will be in order.
Steve, I've been in politics for 22 years, and it was the ugliest night I have ever seen in 22 years.
The legislation was the cornerstone of the Republicans' domestic agenda and would extend limited prescription drug coverage under Medicare to 41 million Americans, including 13 million who had never been covered before. At an estimated cost of just under $400 billion over 10 years, it was the largest entitlement program in more than 40 years, and the debate broke down along party lines.
This is a 15-minute vote.
But when it came time to vote, the Republican leadership discovered that a number of key Republican congressmen had defected and joined the Democrats, arguing that the bill was too expensive and a sellout to the drug companies. Dan Burton and Walter Jones were among them.
They're supposed to have 15 minutes to leave the voting machine open, and it was open for almost 3 hours. And the votes were there to defeat the bill for 2 hours and 45 minutes. And we had leaders going around and gathering around individuals trying to twist their arms to get them to change their votes.
Mr. Speaker, I move reconsideration. I did thanks to your arm twisting.
It was horrible. I mean, we had a good friend from Michigan, Nick Smith, and they even threatened to work against his son who wanted to run for his seat when he retired. I saw a woman, a member of the House, a lady, crying when they came around her trying to get her to change her votes. It was ugly.
On this vote, the yeas are 220, the nays are 215. The conference vote is agreed to.
When the prescription drug bill finally passed shortly before dawn in the longest roll call in the history of the House of Representatives, much of the credit went to former Congressman Billy Tozan of Louisiana, who steered the bill through the House.
No, it's just a messy process. I mean, the old adage about if you like sausage or laws, you should not watch either one of them being made is true. It's a messy process.
The voting machines were open for 3 hours. Why?
Because the vote wasn't finished.
You didn't have the votes?
No, it wasn't finished.
And arms were still being twisted, right?
People were being talked to.
Walter Jones said it was the ugliest night he had ever seen in politics in 22 years.
Well, he's a young member. Had he been around for 25 years, he'd have seen some uglier nights.
But it certainly wasn't ugly for the drug lobby, which invested more than $10 million in campaign contributions during the last election and has been a source of lucrative employment opportunities for congressmen when they leave office. Former Senators Dennis DeConcini and Steve Sims, and former congressmen like Tom Downey, Vic Fazio, Bill Paxson, and former House Minority Leader Robert Michael all registered as lobbyists for the drug industry and worked on the prescription drug bill.
Other members wish to change their vote?
Why was the drug lobby so interested in this bill, and what did it have to gain? Ron Pollock, the executive director of Families USA, a nonpartisan healthcare watchdog group, says it all boiled down to a key provision in the legislation. It prohibited Medicare and the federal government from using its vast purchasing power to negotiate lower prices directly from the drug companies.
What was the main focus of the lobbying effort?
Well, the key goal was to make sure there'd be no interference in the drug companies' ability to charge high prices and to continue to increase those prices.
And whose idea was that?
There's no question that this was prompted by the pharmaceutical lobby.
The drug industry says that competition among private insurance plans that service the Medicare program help keep prices low. But Families USA reported in a January study that Medicare patients are being charged nearly 60% more for the top 20 drugs than veterans pay under a program run by the Veterans Administration. What was the logic, or what was the idea or the rationale behind not giving the government the ability to negotiate drug prices?
It was simply that the drug companies didn't want it. They wanted to make as much money as possible, and if there's negotiation, like there is in other countries around the world, then they're going to have their profit margin reduced.
Before the vote, Congress was told the program would cost a whopping $395 billion over the first 10 years. In fact, Medicare officials already knew it was going to cost a lot more.
Within 2 weeks after the bill was passed, everybody knew it was going to cost well over $500 billion. Many members of the Congress that voted for it said, I would never have voted for it had I known that. They misled us.
Medicare Chief Actuary Richard Foster later told Congress that he revised the cost estimate to $534 billion before the vote, but was told to withhold the numbers from Congress if he wanted to keep his job.
And there struck me as a political basis for making that decision. I considered that inappropriate and, in fact, unethical.
Foster says the person who told him to withhold the revised cost estimates from Congress was Medicare boss Tom Scully.
I want to thank Tom Scully and the whole staff at HHS. And
Scully was the administration's lead negotiator on the prescription drug bill. At the same time, he was also negotiating a job for himself with a high-powered Washington law firm, where he later became a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry.
He was negotiating for his job at the same time that the Medicare legislation was being considered. He wound up taking this job 10 days after the president signed the legislation.
It is but one example of the incestuous relationship between Congress and the industry, and just one of the reasons the pharmaceutical lobby almost never loses a political battle that affects its bottom line. Former Congressman Billy Tozan, who helped push the prescription drug bill through the House, didn't disagree.
Has this bill been good for the drug industry?
It's been good for the patients whom the drug industry represents.
And in terms of profits for the drug companies?
Profits and volumes, yes.
Your old friend John Dingell says of the 1,500 bills over the last 8 years dealing with pharmaceutical issues, the drug companies almost without exception have gotten what they wanted.
Yeah, I would think he's correct. They've done fairly well.
But why has this lobby been so successful?
I believe it's because they stood for the right things.
If former Congressman Tozan sounds a lot like a lobbyist for the drug industry, that's because now he is.
Billy Tozan of the House of Representatives did great work on this bill.
Just 6 weeks after the prescription drug bill was signed into law, Tozan began discussions with the pharmaceutical industry to become its chief lobbyist in Washington. He says,
"That's the truth."
In fairness to Billy Tozan and former Medicare Chief Tom Scully, they weren't the only public officials involved with the prescription drug bill who later went to work for the pharmaceutical industry. Just before the vote, Tozan cited the people who had been most helpful in getting it passed.
And I specifically want to thank the staffs of our committees. From Ways and Means, John McManus, who did such a great job.
Within a few months, McManus left Congress and started his own lobbying firm. Among his new clients were Pharma, Pfizer, Lilly, and Merck.
From the majority side of the Finance Committee, Linda Fishman.
Fishman left to become a lobbyist with the drug manufacturer Amgen.
Not the least of all, but the Energy and Commerce Committee staff who toil so hard for us. Chief of Staff Pat Morrissey.
Morrissey took a job lobbying for drug companies Novartis and Hoffman LaRoche.
And Jeremy Allen.
He went to Johnson & Johnson.
Kathleen Weldon and Jim Barnett.
She went to lobby for Biogen, a biotech company. He left to lobby for Hoffman LaRoche.
They did a marvelous job for this House, and we owe them a debt of thanks. Thank you all.
In all, at least 15 congressional staffers, congressmen, and federal officials who worked on the prescription drug bill left to go to work for the pharmaceutical industry, whose profits were increased by several $billions.
They have unlimited resources, unlimited. And when they push real hard to get something accomplished in the Congress of the United States, they can get it done.